Thank you, Susan, and thank you to all of you for coming tonight to what I think we would all agree is just an extraordinarily timely and important conversation. I can promise you we have a very stimulating and, most importantly, informative session ahead. The two gentlemen seated beside me, the reason why you're here, have given not only more thought to the conflicts that we're contending with today than almost anyone else who you can hear, but most importantly, and we're going to return to this over and over, they're going to help us put it into some context, historical, thematic, analytical context, so that we can figure out actually how should we understand what we're seeing and where might all of this be going. I want to say a couple of things. In addition to what you heard a moment ago from Susan on the credentials of these two gentlemen, two things that you may not know, which I think are worth mentioning. Number one, General Petraeus is the only person in uniform to have thrown out the first pitch at a World Series and to have done the coin toss at a Super Bowl.
A strike. It was a strike.
A strike.
Not that I'm competitive.
Surgical strike. Gives you all something to aspire to, I think. And Lord Roberts, Andrew Roberts, was described in the Wall Street Journal this week as Britain's preeminent military historian. And I want to say just a word about the Wall Street Journal review, because I think it gives you a sense of what we're going to be talking about tonight. The Journal said of this book that it sets a new benchmark in understanding modern war, calling it the single best one-volume study of conventional warfare in the nuclear age. Please join me in welcoming these two to this stage.
You must explain all that sports stuff later on.
I will.
David.
Actually, I also want to thank Evan Osnos. First of all, it's just wonderful to be back on this stage, especially the refurbished 92Y. It includes even a new green room and all the rest of that, because we did a bunch of virtual events. And in fact, I've interviewed Evan, he's interviewed me. They've always been delightful, but to be back on the stage is very, very special. And I'm grateful for that. And then I also just want to thank the 92Y. I understand that the warm-up acts for tonight's event actually were Michelle Obama on one night and then Nancy Pelosi on another. So now you have the main event, and we're glad you could all be here.
How many pitches have they thrown, really?
Yeah, in uniform, no less.
That's
Yeah,
right.
Exactly right.
Andrew, I want to start with you, if I may. You wrote 19 books before you guys embarked on this one, and then you decided, evidently on the 20th book, that you were going to have a co-author. I want to understand why it is that this pairing came about. How did you two embark on this project together?
Well, it was very shortly after the Russian invasion of Ukraine that I got on to David and said, look, there are going to be lots of books, aren't there, about this war and its geopolitical and its political contexts. But what I think really we're going to need is a book on its military history background and where it comes from with regard to that. And David immediately picked up that idea, and then we spoke to the publishers, and the publishers, not unreasonably, said, how are you going to divvy up the chapters? And I said, well, David's going to write about all the countries he's invaded. And I will, and he also wrote about Vietnam as well, which he would have invaded if he'd been the right age. And I will, I'll fill in the rest. That's essentially what happened. And then of course we sent each other's chapters backwards and forwards between each other, and it was an incredibly, profoundly satisfying intellectual experience, I have to say.
So very stimulating. I would support that. And what you didn't read from the Wall Street Journal review was where it said something about, you remember what?
That I softened your edges.
Yes. So softened the edges of General Petraeus' hard prose or something along those lines. But the truth is, we've known each other for a long time. I've had enormous regard for his books for decades. We've done a ton of events. There's another place across the park, I forget their name, it might be the New York Historical Society, but we did 5 events there just on his Churchill book, the best single volume biography by far.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Gentleman in the
I didn't know
back.
your daughter was here.
No, I know.
Family support in that way.
Exactly. No, I thought it was a general, actually. I thought it was a general, anyway, there we are,
And
wellspring.
then he actually invited me to the Clifton Literary Festival. I hadn't even written a book, and interviewed me twice there. This year we went back having written a book, which was a real thrill. And then we had other fun. You know, he had a George III book, The Last King of America. And so we were
No applause there, I
No,
noticed.
I didn't know. I was waiting. Those crickets, I think is what I heard.
We were going to
Tumbleweed.
help raise money for the Army Benevolent Fund in the UK. So I said, why don't we do an event at the Army Museum, which is a great place. And you can ask me the question, could the British have won the American Revolutionary War? And the answer to that is, of course they could have, if they'd had a competent counterinsurgency campaign, which they did.
I have to say, if you're a battlefield commander and you're reading works of analysis and history by folks, shall we say, like the two of us, who are built more for the desk, perhaps, than the battlefield, I'm describing myself.
Nah, me.
Does it feel when you're reading it that you say to yourself, well, wait until you get out there and see how it all goes? Is it...
Occasionally, although as Andrew normally points out, he always in the past has written about dead people. And it's a lot easier because they're not going to challenge you.
Yeah. Or sue.
Sue as well.
So in this book, David, you have an important scheme that you set out at the very beginning.
Yep.
Which is that you have a big idea you want people to carry with them throughout, and I think this is going to help us think about Israel and Ukraine. What is it that the big takeaway that you want people to have is?
So what happened is, as we went through these chapters and we're going back and forth and all the rest of that, what jumped out at us was the critical component that literally determines success or failure in war, and that is strategic leadership, the quality of strategic leadership. And that's the leadership at the very top of, say, a country, and then of the military command that is actually prosecuting this war. A strategic leader has to get 4 tasks right. And uniquely, the strategic leader has to get the big ideas right. All other leaders, by the way, perform these 4 tasks. They just do it within the confines of the big ideas of the strategic leader. So you've got to get the strategy right, the big ideas. You have to really understand the situation in a very nuanced, granular way, and your strengths and weaknesses of your forces, their forces, the physical terrain, human terrain, all this. You have to communicate the big ideas, not just throughout the country and the military force, but to everyone who has a stake in the outcome of the war. You have to oversee the implementation of the big ideas. This is what you normally think of as leadership. It's energy, example, inspiration. It's great, attracting great people to it, keeping them, developing them, allowing those not measuring up to move on to something else. It's how you spend your time. It's a critical component. We call it the battle rhythm when I was doing this in Iraq and Afghanistan. And it's also the metrics that you use. And they have to be very, very, again, rigorously developed and then honestly tracked, unlike, say, the body count in Vietnam, which became a very corrupted number and really undermined integrity over the entire effort. Then there's a 4th task that's often overlooked, but has to be literally on your battle rhythm. You have to have these action forcing mechanisms on your schedule. And that is to determine how you need to refine the big ideas and do it again and again and again. And let me jump to the really serious issue right now, which is how Israel is going to respond to this horrific, unspeakable attack undertaken by terrorists, by Hamas, which, to put it in perspective, you all will be keenly sensitive to this, I think. But again, an awful lot of Americans, they say, okay, 1,300, we lost 3,000 in 9/11 attacks. This would be the equivalent of us losing way over 40,000 per capita. So it's just, this is traumatic. This is unbelievably, and it's personal in a way that even here, everyone, every family, everyone knows someone who is touched by this or has been now mobilized, because you've mobilized 360,000 individuals to come into uniform in a country that's less than 10 million people. So again, very, very, again, significant moment. The big idea so far, and of course we've gone through certain stages. Initially it was just vengeance, this is understandable, revenge, and so forth. Occasionally language that was a little bit perhaps beyond what maybe if you look back at it, noting how horrific this was. But so now we're sort of settled around, okay, we have to destroy Hamas and dismantle the political wing of Hamas. So you're going to take down this terrorist group and also include the Islamic Jihad every time we talk about Hamas. Destroy to a military commander is very precise. It's a doctrinal term. It means that you take away the enemy's capability to accomplish his mission without reconstitution. And that reconstitution is very important because I'm going to come back to this again and again because that's really the question that begs answering how you would do that. The magnitude of this task in a city that will still have, Gaza City initially, still have million-ish people, maybe less than that given the hundreds of thousands of individuals who have evacuated, but high rises, very densely populated, an enemy who doesn't wear uniforms, who is incredibly creative, diabolically, fiendishly, terribly so, and barbaric, as we saw in the attack, presumably will be the same in the defense, know the neighborhood, have tunnels underneath all of it, hide their headquarters underneath hospitals and ammunition caches in mosques, all of this. So again, there will be suicide bombers, there will be improvised explosive devices, and if you really truly destroy Hamas, if you really clear and hold, which is what you need to do, you're going to have to clear every single building, even the high rises, every floor, every room, every cellar, every tunnel. And then you have to control the access to that building still. You have to leave a sizable force because if not, they're going to swarm you and take you hostage. And then you move on to the next one. And ideally, you're actually pushing barriers along with you, which is how we would do it when we were clearing the major cities in Iraq. We would literally have put cement out just to prevent car bombs from coming in. It's hard to prevent people. So I'm laying out the magnitude of this. And again, the enemy fights from the civilian population. They won't reveal themselves until you actually present yourself. You have to actually draw fire from them. And they have nearly 200 hostages that they will sprinkle around and use as human shields. So I cannot actually imagine, Andrew and I were discussing, in the whole sweep of this book, there is nothing that I saw more challenging for a military commander than what the Israeli Defense Forces are about to embark on. Now, yes, you all will rightly point out there was a moment in the Yom Kippur War where the Egyptians had achieved such surprise and early success that it seemed to pose an existential threat to Israel. This is not an existential threat, although it could materialize into an even greater threat. Obviously, we've seen the possibilities. If there was a regional war, if Hezbollah gets involved, the West Bank erupts, even within Israel itself, or Shia militias from Syria, or a variety of other possibilities. But what I've laid out is the magnitude of this task. The casualties will be very considerable. It will take a substantial period of time. We were discussing that Mosul, a city of about the same size as Gaza in northern Iraq, where I had my headquarters as a two-star, with the 101st Airborne Division. It took the Iraqi security forces 9 months to clear Mosul of the 9 months of the Islamic State, also terrorist extremists. Didn't know the neighborhood quite as well. People weren't supportive of them by and large. They wanted to get rid of them because they were so barbaric. Unlike, frankly, there is some support, obviously, for Hamas.
So you think it takes longer than 9 months?
I don't know that. No, I would say the Israeli Defense Forces are better. They're better equipped. They have a lot more technology. But my point is, it's not going to be a couple of weeks.
Yep.
You're going to have to do, if you do this right. Again, if they truly, now they may literally shrink from this. They may look at this and say, whoa, and you're going to create enormous damage, collateral damage to civilian infrastructure, civilian loss of life, and all the rest of that. And we've seen what happened just in response to a horrific event that, by all accounts now, quite evidence, not just intelligence, was caused by an errant rocket launched by Islamic Jihad, not a bomb from Israel, and yet the entire Arab world is up, as is the West Bank, and so forth. So I'm laying this out in some detail because this is a hugely challenging endeavor. And then you're going to take apart the political wing somehow as well. Has to be intelligence-based. And I am very confident, knowing the Israeli Defense Force, knowing the Chief of Staff currently, and others, and Benny Gantz, who's come back to the government, was a counterpart of mine, Chief of Staff, and then Minister of Defense after leaving government. leaving uniform, that is. So they are, I'm sure, saying, okay, Prime Minister, we understand, destroy, that's the natural inclination. Here's what it's going to take. Here's what it will cost. Here are the possible risks. Here's the worst case. But then what?
Then what? That's
you
the
don't
issue.
want to take over Gaza again. You don't want to reoccupy it. There's a reason Israel left it in 2005. Even Egypt doesn't want to take it back over. Nobody wants all these refugees. So then what? And I have been racking my brains, consulting people who understand the region. Keep in mind, I was the commander of this region. I just don't see, can there be an interim transition authority that the Arab states that care so much about the Palestinians would raise their hand and say, yes, I will lead this, our forces. Because keep in mind, this is not just going to be handing out humanitarian assistance and helping to rebuild infrastructure and revive markets and schools and hospitals. This is going to be a counterinsurgency campaign as well, because the bad guys are going to try to come back. There will be remnants. There are always remnants. There are still remnants of the Islamic State that the Iraqis are keeping an eye on with our help in Iraq, and we're helping the Syrian Democratic Forces in Syria. So again, what will that be? And so where's the big, so this all started with the big idea. What is the other big idea for the then what question? And I'll just close by two anecdotes from when I was a mere two-star in Iraq. We're doing the fight to Baghdad, and we take the first major city, several days of fighting, they collapse. I called my boss and I said, hey boss, I got good news and bad news. Good news is we control Najaf. He asked, what's the bad news? I said, we control Najaf. What do you want us to do with it? And he said, call those guys down in Kuwait that you asked about, the plan after Baghdad. I called them and we didn't get any help. We had to leave an entire brigade of forces there for a considerable period of time. But prior to the invasion, I asked actually at the final meeting, the gathering of commanders, and again, I was just a two-star, boss is a three-star, and you had a couple of retired three-stars running this organization for reconstruction and humanitarian assistance. So, excuse me, sir, could you give us a little more detail about what happens after we get to Baghdad and take down the regime? And one of the retired three-stars who knew me, he said, Dave, you just get us to Baghdad, we'll take it from there. That rings pretty hollow now. That was an inadequate. And then we compounded it with two horrible big ideas: fire the military without telling them what their future was, how they'd provide for their families, and fire the Ba'ath Party down to the level of bureaucrats, tens of thousands of them that we needed to actually run the country that we now controlled or owned. So this is, I know this audience, I'm sure, is seized with this issue. And this other big idea has to come together. And I'm sure the military is saying, look, we're ready, we'll do this. It's going to be really costly and hard and damaging, but we'd like to know what happens after we get to Baghdad and take down the regime.
Andrew, you've been thinking about this, what's been happening over the last 12 days from a historical perspective. One of the things that comes through very clearly in this book, and I want to hear your thoughts on what we just heard as David walked us through the likely events to come. One of the themes that comes through in this book is the recurrence of the surprise attack as a strategy. As Paul Wolfowitz once said, the only thing surprising about it is that we're still surprised when it happens. Hamas's attack on Israel was a surprise attack. What is the impact of that ultimately? What does history tell us about the arc of the war that comes from that? And how do you think about analogies as you're trying to make sense of something as dynamic and ongoing as Israel?
Well, obviously, as an historian, I'm looking for analogies the entire time. And there are, I was about to say dozens, but certainly many in this book with regard to surprise attacks. And actually, if you go a little bit earlier to Pearl Harbor and the Second World War and so on, there are surprise attacks as well. The interesting thing about them is it's much easier for a totalitarian or authoritarian regime to, a non-democratic regime to launch a successful surprise attack. Other than Israel in the Six-Day War, I can't think of that many successful surprise attacks that, that democracies kick off with or start a war with, because in general, democracies don't start wars compared to the numbers that totalitarian and authoritarian regimes do. And you look again and again at the surprise attacks and recognise, although this isn't true of the Six-Day War, that overall they actually bring down an opposition, a fury, a sense of being tricked and betrayed, essentially. Excuse me, which works very much against the people who have launched the surprise attacks. It's clear, obviously, in the case of 9/11, but also Pearl Harbor, any number of other attacks. Saddam Hussein in Kuwait, the Falklands, the invasion of the Falklands, the opening of the Yom Kippur War, of course, as well. And so I see that this Hamas surprise attack, I think, will fit into that overall paradigm. The witness of history seems to be that surprise attacks do give you a short-term advantage, of course they do, but in the long term, actually, they are punished harder than a normal state-on-state or unsurprised build-up of a war. It is interesting, this.
And when you look at what we're seeing right now, and we're going to talk about Ukraine in a moment, because it was in some sense the origin of this project.
Yes.
One of the features that you noticed when you looked at Ukraine, and I think it applies to what's happening now in Israel and Gaza, is that we're at a moment in which warfare is more technically advanced than it has ever been, but on the ground you see this oscillation between World War II tactics, World War I tactics, the most primitive kinds of attack, and at the same time these very advanced techniques and very advanced weapon systems. How do you think about that phenomenon, this strange puzzle of kind of going back and forth in history?
Well, what it told us, and what we very much took away from when we were working on this, is that the evolution of warfare is not linear, that it can get stuck into sidings, essentially. It's not going in one direction, and of course it's not, because some wars are in jungles, others are in deserts, some are big, some are small, some are across borders, some are counterinsurgency, and so on. And you can have wars. A classic example being the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s, which went on for 8 years, cost nearly 2 million lives, and saw gas and trenches and barbed wire, and essentially the same kind of war as we had seen 70 years before that in the First World War. And so it's it doesn't tell us, war doesn't naturally tell us what the next war is going to be like. Sometimes there are hints and there are signposts where it does, and actually Ukraine is a classic example of that. And I think that we very much came away with that concept, don't you think, David?
Yeah, and of course we were there 4 months ago. I was back there again just 4 weeks ago.
In Ukraine.
I think, in Ukraine. I think Max Boot has captured it really beautifully. You know, the great Washington Post, he's been on this stage, of course. He said that Ukraine is where All Quiet on the Western Front meets Blade Runner. And there's a lot to that if you think, you know, it is World War I, as Andrew said, sort of World War II armored systems and doctrine. You actually have Cold War era tanks and infantry, the same ones that we were preparing to defeat the Warsaw Pact if they came through the inter-German border. But then you have a new phenomenon, which is a degree of transparency on the battlefield that is just breathtaking. Everyone has a smartphone, internet access, and the ability to upload videos and so forth to social media sites. And then you have very cutting edge, especially on the Ukrainian side. I mean, the Russians have used the Kinshal, this hypersonic system, but it doesn't maneuver at the end. And actually, Patriot shot it down. In fact, the Ukrainians believe that Raytheon should be paying them a premium for actually using their system because it's such great. No one has ever shot a hypersonic missile down before, and the Patriot proves once again that it has stretch goals. But in this case, it's the use of drones.
Yeah,
the maritime drones. There's not that much attention given to way that they have used their longer range systems to do damage to the Crimean airfields. They hit the Black Sea Fleet headquarters during their command and staff meeting, killed 20 or 30 staff officers, but they've denied the Russians the ability to use the port of Sevastopol, is how it's pronounced, I learned, in Crimea, and they had to evacuate their fleet to a Russian base that's farther away. In other words, they're pushing the Black Sea Fleet further off coast, and in some cases denying it the ability to use some of the cruise missiles and other systems that they have launched from the naval systems at the port of Odessa and so on. And those are really quite impressive. And the Russians have some limited cutting edge capabilities. The Ukrainians, in a couple of cases, actually have some bleeding edge. I mean, they're literally producing these and putting them right into service and employing them very, very effectively.
And this is a shock in many ways, because in 2014, when the Russians went into Crimea, Ukraine was not in a position to do this. One of the big changes, and we need to talk about this, the subject of leadership is lurking behind this entire conversation. At one point, you guys quote Jonathan Friedland describing Zelensky as Churchill with an iPhone.
Yes.
What is it about Zelensky that has been so important to this process? Why is it that he has really sort of in some ways changed what might have been the course of this?
Great strategic leadership, but Andrew, go ahead.
Well, absolutely that. The opening line about how he needed ammunition, not a ride. That way in which he said he was going to stay in the capital and fight it out.
These are big ideas. These are huge big ideas.
These are the strategic leadership that David was talking about earlier. The decision not to allow male Ukrainians of serving age to leave the country. The decision to fight in and around Kyiv. I mean, it was like Clemenceau, it was like Churchill, of course, at the time of the Blitz. It was essentially really the quintessential leadership. And then the whole of the rest of the nation, and of course the High Command, know exactly what they need to do. You haven't got a leader who, like the Afghan leader, just jumps in a private jet with as many suitcases full of dollars that he can possibly get his hands on. Instead, you've got somebody who says quite clearly, my family are staying here and we are going to fight this out. And when David and I visited Kyiv, one of the things, and we talked to a lot of the generals and ministers there, one of the things that came over very, very strongly was this sense that they were going to fight this one through to the bitter end, and that they weren't going to be, I mean, obviously the help that they're given by the West is absolutely essential, but they weren't going to be essentially dictated to by the West. They were going to fight this one through.
And contrast that with Putin. So Zelensky on the first day of the war changes into his OD uniform of the day, whatever it is. And even when he addresses Congress in a positively Churchillian manner, he wears, again, the OD sweatshirt. Putin, on the other hand, sitting in a suit in the Kremlin at the end of a long table with the minions way down there, so they're sure they remember where their place in the pecking order is. Zelensky goes to the front lines. He's in Bakhmut at the height of the fighting. He's in Zaporizhzhia, all these different difficult places. So you have, again, he got the big ideas right. He communicated them brilliantly. You know, not surprisingly, he was an actor, a comedian who played the president so well that he got elected president. And then he's overseen the implementation of the big ideas very impressively. Again, example, inspiration, all the rest of this, driving that campaign plan, driving the Western countries to provide more, accelerate the pace of decisions and so forth. And then they've periodically adapted the big ideas. Now, some of that's more at the military side, particularly with the summer counteroffensive, where they just didn't have the air power and the mounted breaching systems when they confronted what turned out to be miles deep minefields, not just a few hundred meters, and much denser placement of both anti-tank and anti-personnel mines. They had to adapt. And so what they did is they went from armored systems to 10-man squads, and instead of achieving kilometers a day, which they hoped they would achieve, they're achieving 100 meters a day, and some days not on others, but they're gradually grinding forward. But you see the adaptation, and that's crucial because no plan survives contact with the enemy. And the question is, how well do you adapt to that? It's still an uncertain affair, but they did win the Battle of Kyiv. That was the overall objective. They won the battles of Sumy and Chernihiv in the northeast, Kharkiv in the east, Kharkiv Oblast, the rest of the province, and then Kherson west of the Dnipro River. So there's no Russian forces west of the Dnipro anymore, which sort of bisects the country, running through Kyiv as well. And then gradually chipping away, although it's been a very, very tough slog. But they intend to fight. You know, another big idea, there's going to be no lull this winter.
Yeah.
They're going to keep on fighting all summer, all fall, all winter. Reminiscent of Grant, you know, when he said, Mr. President, I intend to fight it out all summer in this line, if that's what it takes, about the wilderness campaign of 1864. And it ended up taking all summer, all fall, all winter, and then part of the spring until he finally caught up with Lee at Appomattox.
To carry on that concept of that David was mentioning about the various weapons.
Yeah.
Of course, we don't argue at all in this book that a future war involving NATO, involving the United States, would necessarily look like what's happening in Ukraine, because NATO does have weaponry that is so advanced that we haven't given to the Ukrainians, at least not yet, that it would be a totally different kind of war. So our last chapter in this book, chapter 10, is entitled The Future of War, and we look at drones and AI, robotics, sensors, cyber, space, and so on, in a way of trying to look to those signposts, those hints that you can get from Ukraine, but also that you can get from the technological world as it is today anyhow.
We, in that Future of War chapter, the final chapter, we recall an old adage that I remember during the Cold War period. We recited it a lot, but we really couldn't turn it into reality, but we sure recited it a lot. And it went, what can be seen can be hit, what can be hit can be killed. And the idea was, you know, you're supposed to get deep in the enemy and you see it and you kill it and all that stuff. The truth is we couldn't see all that well. We didn't have drone, we didn't have all the systems we had now. So you couldn't see much beyond the forward edge of the battle as it was put. And even if you could, if it was moving target, it was very difficult to hit. We weren't good at dynamic targeting. If you look at the Indo-Pacific theater now, and that's the main effort, you know, we are obviously riveted on what's happening in Ukraine and now in Gaza and the Middle East. But really the main effort still has to be the relationship between the US and our Western allies and partners in China, where you just were again recently. In that theater, you can see just about everything. Unless it's under the water, it's a bit more difficult. You can hit just about everything, and some of these will be hit with hypersonics that maneuver before, so they're difficult to defend against, and therefore you can kill anything. And so what we have to do, the new big idea is you've got to transform your forces for that theater at least. That's not to say you don't need other kinds of forces for other theaters, but you have to transform them from a small number of very large platforms that are incredibly capable, heavily manned, exorbitantly expensive, but vulnerable, to a massive number of unmanned systems that are increasingly going to be not remotely piloted, but algorithmically piloted, where the human in the loop is the person who actually designs the conditions, determines the conditions, and then designs the software that is used.
I have to tell you, folks, there is a moment in this book that will blow your mind where you're, for the first time, confronted with the prospect that we are going to be dealing not just with drones on human warfare, drones on drone warfare, essentially robot on robot. Just think for a second about what that means and the implications. There is a whole part of this that helps you think through what the next frontier is looking like. I want to talk in a moment just about Taiwan and China. We can't leave this stage without talking about it. But before we get to that, I want to pin you down for just a second on Ukraine and the key question, one that was asked some years ago by a general in the U.S. Army who said, tell me how this ends.
Yeah, so this is when, again, I was that young two-star division commander. We're on the fight to Baghdad, and I'm watching the assumptions we'd been given invalidate by one. And I had an embedded reporter, as we all did. I forgot I was on the record. Rick Atkinson, 3-time Pulitzer Prize winner.
Never trust a reporter.
Never. And I started asking sort of rhetorically, tell me how this ends. Because it was clear to me it wasn't going to end the way they had said it was going to end. And of course, I was asked that question repeatedly in all my subsequent commands, including the surge in Iraq. And we did provide an answer to that lasted for about a good 3.5 years until, unfortunately, the Prime Minister undid it. I think the only way to answer that question, especially having taught economics once in my life, is to say it depends. And it does depend. It depends on continued U.S. and Western support. And here I'll just note that the Europeans have provided a good bit more in the financial, economic, and humanitarian assistance than we have. So they've stepped up to the plate, and we believe they've pledged more on the military side than we're at $44 billion, huge sum of money, but not unaffordable for the United States. And this is about as right versus wrong as we've seen in recent times, up until the Hamas attack at least. And we very much need to support a fellow democracy, however flawed, to do everything they can to convince Putin sooner rather than later that this war is unsustainable. That support is crucial. If it continues, my hope would be that at some moment, and it's impossible to predict, that the Russians will crack and crumble because Ukrainians know what they're fighting for. They look over their shoulder. It's their survival, their independence. The Russians look around and they see a bunch of very unhappy Ukrainians who hate them because they're occupying their particular region of the country. But it really ends up revolving around Putin and his willingness at some point in time, especially if the Ukrainians can change the dynamic in some way, cut off the forces that are just north of Crimea from those that are in the southeast by cutting the line of communication and reducing their ability to resupply through Crimea, the way I said that they've been doing. And then either get some kind of negotiated resolution, after which you can have a European-led Marshall-like reconstruction plan, path to NATO and EU membership. My fear is that it's going to take longer than sort of the winter offensive, the next summer offensive.
And with regard to what you were saying about China, and presumably therefore the dangers of an attack on Taiwan, the question is, how do you essentially escape the Thucydidean trap? The classic title given to the seeming inevitability of a clash between a totalitarian power, a bit like Sparta, versus the democratic power of Athens with regard to China and the United States. And the answer is deterrence, is spending money on deterrence. It is tremendously expensive. Of course, the United States does pay far more per capita than any other Western democracy on deterrence. But the amount that you spend on deterrence is always a tiny fraction of what you would spend were deterrence to fail and warfare to result.
On that point, I want to pick up on something you just mentioned, this question of the deterrent effect, not only of what the United States may be doing in the Indo-Pacific, but also there is a deterrent effect, in effect, of watching these wars at the moment.
I couldn't agree more.
I think one of the questions, and we're going to get to questions right now from the audience, there's terrific questions in here. And somebody asked, to what extent do you think the unfolding situation in Israel-Palestine will impact Chinese policy towards Taiwan over the next few years?
I think I might even take it out and ask policy for Ukraine, and even some previous episodes. Would-be attackers, Putin, for example, he saw us withdraw from Afghanistan. We only had 3,500 troops there, hadn't lost a soldier in 18 months. Still, it seemed to be, and yes, it was unsatisfactory, maddening, frustrating. Partners are highly imperfect, et cetera. But still, that could have been sustained, and I argued at the time that I feared that we would come to regret the decision to withdraw. I hope that we have, because it's a disastrous situation for those on the ground who we tried to help for 20 years, and it was very sustainable. Sustainability is measured in terms of blood and treasure. The red line that was not a red line in Syria, community unhelpful. The inadequate response to Crimea and the Donbass in Ukraine. The relatively inadequate response to the invasion of South Ossetia and Abkhazia and Georgia by Russia. All of these, I think, add up. And again, if you don't show resolve in one area, and now the latest, of course, is our support for Israel, which I think the big idea for us, I very much agree with. I think it is that we have Israel's back, and we do, and we're going to provide everything that we possibly can. We're going to ask Congress for more, and hopefully we can resolve the issues in the House of Representatives and do that. Package it, by the way, with Ukraine, Taiwan, southern border, FEMA, whatever. So again, I believe these are all related. And keep in mind that deterrence is a factor of two elements. It's the potential adversary's assessment of your capabilities on the one hand, and I described why we need to transform our capabilities, also harden them, improve their defenses, disperse them, take them underground, et cetera. And then it's your willingness to employ those capabilities.
Your credibility, in effect.
And if your credibility is suspect, then that deterrent effect will be much weaker. So this, I think it's actually quite important. It's really important that our leaders, our strategic leaders in particular, realize that when they say something, the rest of the world is listening. If you say, for example, Bashar al-Assad must go, Syrian dictator, and then you do nothing about it, and you declare a red line, and then you don't do anything when it's crossed, then again, your credibility starts to erode.
And in the other direction, having assumed, we now know that Putin basically believed that the West would not be able to find its way to any sort of coherent response. I think a reasonable analysis suggests China is watching that, and it
Very
is
much so.
factoring into its into its decision making.
Yep.
A big question and an important one. Somebody asks, can you ever see an end to conflict? Do you imagine a scenario?
He's the historian.
And I will frame it actually with one item. And I mean, you frame this book saying this is the age of mutually assured destruction. You know, we came out of World War II saying this United Nations is designed to put an end to war, and instead we've had between 150 and 300 wars since then.
What's the title of the first chapter?
The Death of the Dream of Peace.
Yeah.
And of course it also leads us on to that quote from Plato about only the dead have seen the end of war. And I think that, unfortunately, and that was said 2,000 plus years ago, and he's been proved right. Yes, of course, we would love to have some kind of a utopia whereby all nations were able to, and within nations, all groupings were able to find a way of getting to nirvana without physical violence. But I'm afraid that I feel now, and especially actually since the Saturday before last, that the kind of violence that we saw in southern Israel makes me feel even more than I have already that, if anything, we are capable of throwbacks that go back to medieval style savagery, and I can't see the end of war.
I'm going to combine a few questions here because they're on a similar theme, and I think it's an important one, which is, to what extent do you believe the state of domestic politics, and we'll take the United States because that's where we are, how much are adversaries, potential aggressors, looking at what's happening here in the United States and making choices?
No, look, so we did the pre-book tour in the UK. I also went over to Warsaw. I'm on the board of the Warsaw Security Forum. You have all the leaders from NATO who are all there. They all collared me, and they said, what in the world is going on? What is happening in Washington? And will this undermine your support for Ukraine? It has. I mean, we have $5 billion left, and that we only have that $5 billion left because the Pentagon happily made this huge accounting error. They were overvaluing what it was they were giving, and you had to have the depreciated cost, or either that or it's creative accounting that opens up the ability to provide $5 or $6 billion more dollars. But that's it until we get a new authorization and appropriation. That's very worrisome. And then, of course, lots of questions about, who's going to be elected in November next year, and if there's a re-election of someone from the past, how would that affect your foreign policy? So they watch this very, very carefully. The Ukrainians understand the dynamics in our House and Senate better than 99% of the Americans.
At one point, there was a report last year that the People's Liberation Army in China had made an internal calculation in their own analysis that they assessed that the U.S. House of Representatives was eventually going to wind down support for Ukraine, and that factored into their own decision-making about how to deal with the Russians on this question.
Sure. It's all connected, always.
Obviously, as an Englishman, with regard to discussing American politics, I don't want to intrude on private grief. But nonetheless, it's not a gentlemanly thing to do. But nonetheless, I can't help, and many of my countrymen can't help but think that the greatest and most powerful nation in the world has to have a better system than the one where you lock down and you have these extraordinary moments where you can't even choose a speaker of your lower house. It really, you've got to come up with something better than that.
It does sound rather embarrassing.
Wait a second, how many prime ministers has the UK had in the last 5 years?
In a wonderful parliamentary system where we would have, I have to say, yes, you're quite right, we've had three. But what we've also got is a leader of the opposition who's probably going to become Prime Minister next year, and a Prime Minister who both see totally eye to eye on Ukraine, on the big issues, on Israel and so on. You don't have two parties that are at loggerheads with one another. So yes, we might have quite a few Prime Ministers come and go, but at least they see eye to eye on the really big issues.
We have a couple of questions here about intelligence, and I want to ask one of the ones that's been posed by the audience and one also about the book. One question is about what seems to have been an intelligence failure before Israel. How do you explain it? What do you think went wrong? And then and the second piece of this is that we saw something very interesting before the Ukraine war, which is the United States and its allies made a decision to share intelligence publicly. That was a play. That was an interesting
and we
strategy.
go into this in some
It's fascinating. And I'm curious whether you think we're going to see more of it.
I thought it was brilliant. It's difficult to do because what you're doing is you're taking finished intelligence products that are based on very sensitive sources and methods, and you're laundering it into something that can be publicly released without exposing those sources and methods. And I thought it was very well done, and I thought it was very wise to do it because it established enormous credibility for the U.S. leadership at that point in time, and the U.K., which did the same, and they were in league because this is the closest intelligence relationship in the world. So again, I thought it was a very smart thing to do. And then when they actually did do what the intelligence said it was going to happen, again, enormous credibility. Keep in mind that followed, of course, the damage to our credibility by the withdrawal from Afghanistan and the way that was conducted, and actually some intelligence, at least questionable intelligence assessments about how long the Afghan security forces would be able to prevail. For what it's worth, I said 3 weeks prior to the collapse that I feared an Afghan security force collapse. And it's because I knew that we had not only withdrawn our 3,500 troops, but we'd withdrawn about 17,000 Western maintenance workers that were required to keep this very sophisticated helicopter fleet and aircraft fleet that we insisted on buying American and giving to the Afghans. While I was the commander, I said, we only want refurbished Russian systems. They're analog, they can repair them and they can use them, and they work reasonably well out here. So again, that was something you could see coming. The Intel failure is interesting because it happened to an institution that I worked with very closely, including after government. I have this enormous respect for Shin Bet. This is the internal security matter, of course, Gaza and the West Bank. They're normally literally upstream is the description. I love the cases that I can't get into, but so many of those where they know what's going to happen.
We won't say anything.
No,
if you want to get into them, that's
And when they release the video publicly 2 weeks from now, of course, I'm sure it won't go anywhere. But they normally can, and they can even stop stuff from happening. So they know what people are thinking even before they actually do it. And I think there were a number of factors here. The most important is that the Hamas operational security improved dramatically, just orders of magnitude. They apparently came to understand, again, something about these sources and methods, there are many of them, and then figured out how they would keep from revealing what it was they were planning and training and equipping for and posturing for in ways that would allow those sources and methods to pick it up, and apparently even release some disinformation in those channels that misled those that were reading it. Now, you can also ask whether Mossad could have picked up more from Iranian support, the funding, the equipping, and all the rest of that. Less urgent in this sense. And then, about 8,200, the NSA of Israel, and then also the Defense Intelligence. But then you also had they were focused a bit more on the West Bank. Some of the military forces moved there. The unrest there has been unsettling, trying to keep a handle on that. And then, of course, frankly, the domestic political turmoil there represented threats in certain cases if it gets out of hand, and that, therefore, it's a bit more sometimes than the police can handle, and certainly the intelligence component of it had to be worrisome. So in that sense, and then you also had an over-reliance, I think, on these sensors and cameras and all the other, again, sensitive systems that they had for real-time situational awareness. And Hamas understood what these systems were, and they took out the connective tissue, the nodes. Think of it as a cell phone tower. They just took them out and they degraded that or blinded them from seeing what was happening before they actually realized that the bulldozers all the way through. And here come the golf carts and the cars and the paragliders, and the creativity of this was quite extraordinary. So you put all that together, and then you have it's on a Shabbat, and it's a religious observance to boot. And even the military is on leave, et cetera. And you put all that together, and you can understand how you have both an intelligence failure and a military readiness failure.
In the book, one of the things you mentioned is that, historically, one of the great intelligence failures of all time was the failure to see 40,000 Chinese troops crossing the Yalu River into Korea. And in some ways, an intelligence failure like that can shape the course of a conflict. When you look at what's happening now, do you think that is going to be an enduring problem in this war, or is it something that they rebound from?
It's certainly something they rebound from, because people do learn the lessons. This is one of the lessons that history has to teach us. And ultimately, you're quite right about the 40,000 that crossed the Yalu River, but actually, ultimately, it was 160,000. It was extraordinary that they weren't picked up, although the Chinese did go to immense measures in order to ensure that wasn't seen, of course. But yes, I think that Shin Bet and the Mossad and other intelligence agencies will pick up on this, but it doesn't mean that 10 years, 15, 20 years down the line, that the same thing doesn't happen again. Look at 1967, the Six-Day War, and only 7 years after that extraordinary success, that incredible victory, the same thing happens to Israel in Yom Kippur. And we go into Yom Kippur for obvious reasons a lot in this book, not least because it did lead to a paradigm shift in the way that people looked at various weapon systems. The tank, for example, which, as we've seen in Ukraine, it's sort of gone in and out of fashion already twice in the course of one war that's only 18 months or so long. And you have the same thing in Yom Kippur, where the anti-tank missiles seem to be the key factor. And then, only a few days later, it becomes clear that actually the Israelis are able to use tanks in the most imaginative way, since the Battle of Kursk. And there's a marvelous line from a American general who says that tanks are a bit like dinner jackets, in that you don't need them very often, but when you do, nothing else will do.
We're going to take just a few extra minutes here, because I don't think anybody here is racing out of the opportunity to hear more from these two. There is a great question here that I think would help a lot of folks in this room. It's about information. And it's about the information of how do we process as news users, as consumers, as responsible citizens, and as analysts, as people who are thinking about this. How do you assess the news that's coming in? What are you reading? Where do you find reliable news? How do you make choices about what to believe and not to believe? Help us think about how to process.
It's a really good question, I guess, especially for me, because I went from a life where I had, especially over the last couple of decades, access to the highest intelligence that was out there. Ultimately, the Presidential Daily Brief, in the final few, the 4-star assignments, parts of it at least, and certainly as a CIA director, we still prepared it at the CIA headquarters. And you go from that to not having that, as you obviously don't when you leave government, and you have to sort of piece together your own intelligence system, and you have to have your own feeds. And so what's interesting is I've actually made, for example, a list of the podcasts that I listen to. The number one podcast I listen to every single day is The Economist Intelligence. Others, I'll look at the subject, for example, New York Times Daily or something, you know, and I have sort of a pecking order, a priority order that I work my way through. By the way, I listened to your weekly podcast, New Yorker, with Susan Glasser. And,
you're the one.
Jane.
I wondered.
It's also delightful. As you can see, part of the reason is it's obviously focused much more on domestic politics and so forth. But again, these, and then you have to understand, I think, the perspective of columnists in particular.
Yeah. And
you know that if this certain columnist is writing, he has a particular perspective. It's a particular departure point. You have to understand the editorial policies separate from the op-ed writers or the columnists. And, you know, certain papers have a slightly different slant on certain issues. The New York Times was not my all-time favorite when I was commanding the surge in Iraq, especially when they gave a cut rate to MoveOn.org to criticize me personally in a full-page ad the day of the biggest testimony in my life. But again, you have to understand the perspective of all of these. So you're asking, what is it? You know, you should understand that the Washington Post editorial is going to be from a slight, I tend to agree with them by the most time. And then I think it's really about even networks. Yeah. I'm on the speaking circuit still, you know, surprising there's no half-life so far in that regard, commendably, because it's the highest form of white-collar crime in America. But you know, so you often talk with folks either prior or after, and I can tell within anywhere from 3 to 5 minutes if they only watch this one certain channel, which I was on twice today, I think. It takes them about 7 minutes to, if the other channel, because there are certain words that just keep getting, you know, woke here or this, that, you know, again, and it's fascinating. So again, you really need to understand, and because I have refused to hire with any one channel, so I do them all, and if you sit and listen, you know, and Fox, very different obviously than MSNBC, CNN somewhere, it's really important to understand that orientation. But that takes a very assiduous amount of sort of study, analysis, and you have to have some sense there are still facts, there are still objective reality out there, and you have to understand that as a base case to the extent you can, and then understand the perspective that this particular reporter, network, columnist, generally I think the reporters try pretty hard to be truthful and so forth in the major mainstream media.
You just haven't met enough of us, actually.
You're right.
One of the things that I think it's very important for us to remember is that in this era of disinformation and also in this era of conspiracy theories, that actually both of those things are used by our enemies in order to undermine our unity. What I've been, I have to say, slightly shocked by, especially in the last couple of days, was what President Herzog of Israel has rightly called a blood libel on the Israeli people. That so many news organizations automatically assumed that it was Israel that had bombed this hospital. And many said deliberately the word genocide has been flung around, when what the objective analysis has shown is that actually, first of all, it wasn't 1,000 people who died there, it was between 10 and 20. 10 and 20 is still a terrible thing to have happen in a hospital, but nothing like 1,000 that Hamas claimed. That Hamas, when newspapers say that the Palestinian health authorities, what the Palestinian health authorities is Hamas. And when you also have this sense that that Israel can be accused automatically and have so many news organizations automatically say that this is true, including, I have to say, the New York Times, it does strike me as the problem here is Israel's essentially sort of fighting with one arm behind his back.
I'm going to, one more question for you before folks go, and I think it brings us back to one of the things that we started with. And it's a question that if you found yourself in the position of advising the Israeli leadership about the process that they are about to go through over the course of the next weeks and months. What is one piece of advice, based on what you've learned, how you've practiced it in your own lives, what is one piece of advice that you would leave them with?
I think it would be, again, study this intellectual construct for strategic leadership. Very, very carefully think through each of those tasks, especially getting the big ideas right. Vengeance is not a strategy. It's an understandable impulse after something as horrific as was experienced. But we got to think your way through this. So first and foremost, again, understand you can order your military to destroy Hamas. That's a legitimate mission, if you will, for the military. But understand the costs that it will entail. Understand the damage it's going to inflict, all the rest of this, and understand that if you destroy not just Hamas and Islamic Jihad, but dismantle the Hamas political wing, that you need to have a plan for the day after. And this is a very, very, very thorny issue. The problem is that if you don't destroy them and have a subsequent plan, they will come back and you will have taken enormous sacrifices, and it will not be an enduring solution. I'd really love to see this be a catalyst for something. You know, the differences between this and the Yom Kippur War are enormous. Actually, Henry Kissinger was at a lunch that we were at yesterday, and I think quite forthrightly noted that, you know, in the wake, once you got a ceasefire there, because of course the Israeli tanks are on the road to Cairo, so you have some leverage. And he said, well, you know, but I could call individuals, could call Sadat in Egypt, the president, and he didn't believe that Israel didn't have a right to exist and that all Israeli Jews should be killed the way Hamas does. He was actually willing to make a deal, to agree to a historic peace agreement that was reached. And you have Golda Meir, you can call her. Also, you could call King Hussein. You can talk to, again, the Hafiz al-Assad in Damascus and so forth. So it's a very, very different situation. But nonetheless, wouldn't it be incredible if there was a catalyst? And that should involve, another big idea should be to communicate what the vision is for the Palestinians in Gaza after Hamas is destroyed, and also for the Palestinians in the West Bank as well. Again, hearts and minds really do matter. And if you want support over the longer term, you have to lay out for them why their life will be better if they reject Hamas instead of support or tolerate Hamas.
I agree with every word of that. I also think that, just speaking as an historian, we know what happens when a death cult that essentially doesn't care about its own people but just wants to try to kill as many Jews as possible takes over a country. It becomes near impossible to do anything other than ultimately extirpate it, which is what I hope the IDF are going to do, and our hopes and prayers should be with them. But what does take its place, and David's come up with a couple of ideas about what that might be, whatever takes its place in Gaza, and hopefully also one day in the West Bank too, must be a new education system that does not teach 8-year-old Palestinians that it's acceptable to kill Jews. You have to have something better. You have to have something to look forward to make people want to see a future that everyone can live in. And education is absolutely central to that.
I have to tell you, folks, this is a week where a lot of us are talking about the importance of never forgetting history, never forgetting the battles we've fought, the lives that have been lost along the way. This book is part of that process of not having to relearn lessons over and over again. Please join me in thanking these two extraordinary speakers.
Thank you.
Very good.
Thank you.
Thanks, really enjoyed that.